Good morning and welcome to Coffee with the Pastor on Monday. Monday, we got to be ready for it and hit it again, huh? We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we finished the Beatitudes. Today we're continuing on with the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to be talking about the Christian's influence, the believer's influence. Jesus is on the mount on that hillside, and he's preaching to the multitude. And he says this, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Jesus said, and he's looking at this crowd of folks who mostly are just poor, just good Galilean folks. Some folks may have come from Syria or wherever, but they were not the elite. We talked about last week a little bit that the religious leaders of Jesus' day, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, well, not so much the Essenes, but the Pharisees and the priests and all, they were into excluding people. If you were rich, you were blessed. If you were well-connected, if you're well-educated, right rabbi schools, all like that, you were in. But most of the folks were not. And yet Jesus looks and says, "You're the salt of the earth." And basically, and these folks had probably never been told that you're important. Well, let's talk about salt for a minute. What was salt used for back then? Well, they had a couple of main ingredients, main things that salt was used for. One is it preserved their meat. They didn't have refrigerators back then, obviously. And so they they could rub salt on their meat and it would preserve it. It would last for a long time. And so it preserved. And that's a little bit of what we are supposed to be doing in our own life, in the life of the believer. He says, you're going to preserve our society. And one of the things that we know and that we see, if society is just left to themselves, they get very decadent. If I could use the metaphor of the meat, they get rotten. There's moral decay. And it's the believers, and right now I believe the church is what I would say, but we are to be the ones that preserve our society. We're the ones to be able to show and to teach what our society is. And so salt was used for preserving. The other thing it was used for was just to add flavor. I don't know about you, but boy, food without salt just doesn't taste very well. I've tried to use not as much salt for health reasons, but a little bit of salt will flavor the food some and will make the food taste much better. I think that's what believers here are supposed to be doing. People of God are supposed to be adding flavor to life. And I tell you what, most people do. When people do the works that we're supposed to be doing, it does well. It says that the salt loses its if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? Well, I have a friend that works for Martin Salt, and he's a very fine Christian. And he told me something. He said, salt just becomes salt. It never loses its saltiness. It does that. So I did a little research into what this would mean. And they would gather the salt probably around the Dead Sea. But they didn't have the refineries and things to get it out like what we do today. And sometimes there would be some type of white substance or something on there that may be more like road dust than it was salt. And they would put it out and it didn't taste like that. He said, well, that's what it's like when we don't do our jobs as being the salt of the earth. So Jesus says we're the salt of the earth. He looks at his crowd and says, you're the salt of the earth. And then he says, you're the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Well, Jesus says you're the light of the world, and a town built on a hill cannot be hidden because the lights are there. I see Ellie's on here today. When we go over to the Holy Land, Ellie's our guide. And Ellie takes us over to a place from where Jesus grew up, was in Nazareth. And it was there's a Roman city about 4 miles from there, Sepphoris. Zapori, I think, is how it's said over there, but we call it Sepphoris. But Sepphoris was a Roman city being built. In fact, it's a very interesting city. It's a city that I feel like was being built probably at a time when Joseph and Jesus would have been working as carpenters. And probably a lot of their work was over in Sepphoris. But it was a large Roman city, and I can imagine, just being a few miles away, Jesus probably could see that city on the hill over there and see the lights. They had a theater, they had all kinds of things. And we feel like Jesus probably went to the theater, and we'll talk more about that later, because he used theater language, like the word hypocrite was the word that they used for actors back then. But he said, you can't put a city on a hill and it not be seen. He says, likewise, somebody who is a person of God can't be hid. If we serve God, people are going to know it. They're going to know that we're believers. We're going to know that we're Christ followers. They're going to know that because of our lives. They're going to see things different in us than they see in the world. The world's a dark place. The world left to itself will be of decay. It will be sinful. It will be through the fallen. But when they see believers, they see God in us. They see goodness in us. And through our good works, they will see that there is something else in this world, and it's God. And Jesus looks and says, you're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. And it's important. And we've talked before about how light is such a huge symbol in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. That we need to be light. Our influence needs to be in our society. And a lot of it is just how we act, what we do, that we're just different. And somebody once told me that, a believer is the only Bible that some people will ever see. I mean, they're not going to open their Bibles, they're not going to read it, they're not going to see what they're supposed to do. But when they look at a believer and see how they act, that's how they know who God is. And we're to use our influence, and I hope you'll use your influence today. I hope people will be able to look at you and say, there's something about that person. And I hope today you'll be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. God's blessings upon you, and we'll talk to you tomorrow, and we'll look at the Sermon on the Mount more tomorrow. Thank you, and have a good day.